Have you heard about this thing called postmodernism? If you have, you've probably also been told that it's as confusing as it is complicated. But don't worry. Stephen Hicks has got a book for you. Explaining postmodernism, skepticism, and socialism from Rousseau to Foucault is as accessible as it is available. Front and center when you search postmodernism on Amazon.com, it's available for $0 if you have an Audible or Kindle Unlimited account, and the paperback is only $27. But if you haven't got an Audible subscription or $27 to drop on the expanded edition, don't worry. The original 2004 edition is free to download on stephenhicks.org. English not your first language? Explaining Postmodernism has been translated into 13 different languages, including Urdu, Swedish, Portuguese, and my personal favorite, Hebrew. So why is Hicks' book so popular? Well, just look at these editorial reviews. By the end of explaining postmodernism, the reader will remain ill at ease with postmodernist malaise, but Hicks' lucid account will demystify the subject. Curtis Hancock, PhD, The Review of Metaphysics. With clarity, concision, and an engaging style, Hicks exposes the historical roots and philosophical assumptions of the postmodernist phenomenon. More than that, he raises key questions about the legacy of postmodernism and its implications for our intellectual attitudes and cultural life. Stephen M. Sanders, PhD, Reason Papers. In fact, stephenhicks.org features no less than 9 academic reviews. So there's really only one small problem. Explaining Postmodernism is the worst book ever written on the subject. These are some of the available videos which have also discussed this text. I've included links to each of the videos in the description if you want to watch them for yourself, but as these videos have covered certain aspects of Hicks' text, often overlapping, I will be focusing on those areas which I feel have been adequately covered, specifically Hicks' treatment of postmodernism itself, so to speak. Čeika's video runs for just shy of 53 minutes, and I think he does a good job addressing many of the core issues with Hicks' text. His idiosyncratic perspective on the Enlightenment, oversimplified perspective on pre-Enlightenment European philosophy, and general scholarly sloppiness. He also addresses, fairly early in the video, a number of Hicks' claims and misreadings of several postmodern theorists. This video is the longest of the 3 at just over 2.5 hours, and the 3 hosts, Friedman, Guida, and Kelly, conclude that while Hicks' thesis is unsubstantiated, the book itself is a good faith interrogation of postmodernism. They do also discuss Čeika's video, but determine his critique is in bad faith. The hosts all seem to have an interest in learning about the subject, but I feel don't have enough of a grasp on the history to adequately critique the text, but more on this later. Ormond's video runs for about 1 hour and 40 minutes and features a very in-depth analysis of Hicks' claims about pre-Enlightenment philosophers, as well as some cogent information on Richard Rorty, Kant, and Hume. This video, just shy of 1 hour, is from Hicks' own The Open College podcast, where he responds to both Čeika's and the Multiversity Project's video. Hicks really leans into the idea that Čeika is critiquing him in bad faith, but it is his response to the Multiversity Project questioning the inclusion of Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon as postmodernists that is incredibly revealing. I'll be talking about this later in the video. Hicks' central thesis is that in the face of the failed Marxist, he tends to use socialist and leftist interchangeably and more frequently, project, instead of simply abandoning socialism, dedicated intellectuals developed postmodern theory to backdoor their political ideology into academic institutions. They accomplished this through 2 major methodologies: Derridian deconstruction and Foucauldian power relations. Deconstruction is poorly defined by Hicks, but the closest he approaches it is on page 16. In one version of deconstruction, represented by those who agree with the quotation from Fish on page 2 above, literary criticism becomes a form of subjective play in which the reader pours subjective associations into the text. In another version, objectivity is replaced by the view that an author's race, sex, or other group membership most deeply shaped the author's views and feelings. Thus, his explanation is that the idea that any given text will have a fixed objective meaning determined by the author is rejected out of hand. In place of this meaning, the reader is free to inject whatever meaning they want into whatever text they choose. Now, it is very important that Hicks has chosen to cite Fish when he is defining deconstruction, because he has, for reasons that will become clear, chosen not to cite Derrida on what could be termed his deconstructive method. It is true Hicks does reference a quote of Derrida's, twice in fact, speaking about deconstruction, but it is only in service to connecting deconstruction to Marxism. No, Hicks cites Fish because he thinks this quote is emblematic of deconstruction as a practice, and it serves his narrative. Here is the quote. "Deconstruction," Stanley Fish confesses happily, "relieves me of the obligation to be right, and demands only that I be interesting." The problem is that Hicks is not a careful reader, because while Fish does discuss deconstruction in Is There a Text in This Class?, it's on page 299 and 303. He doesn't discuss it on the page Hicks cites, page 180, or anywhere else within that chapter. And this is where it gets weird. The quote is from a chapter titled Interpreting the Variorum, referencing a response to the titular essay which was originally published in the journal Critical Inquiry in 1976. As it turns out, this essay is the original source of the quote Hicks cites, something that is revealed in the second sentence of the first paragraph of this chapter, page 174. But as we know, Hicks doesn't cite this. He cites page 180. Why? Well, here is an emblematic instance of Hicks' citational style, what can charitably be called quote mining. Because the passage Hicks cites is an amended version from the original on page 174, but Hicks has removed that amendment. Really changes the context of the quote, huh? And you know what else really changes the context? This response to interpreting the Variorum contains the most unfortunate sentence I ever wrote. I have long since repudiated this declaration along with the relativism it implies. Yeah, I can see why you wouldn't want to cite a quote that happens in between sentences which completely contradicts the point you had mined the quote to make. But this then begs the question, why didn't Hicks simply cite the original journal article? This too will become clear. Turning now to Foucauldian power relations, they have been developed to replace the classic Marxist binary of class antagonisms. No longer is the main driving force of Western civilization the bourgeoisie oppressing the proletariat, but rather a grab bag of oppressors and oppressed from every identity group you can think of, locked in a struggle for power. When the method of deconstruction is deployed by the postmodernists to attack anything of value, i.e., Western civilization, it is done in the service of the marginalized to attack their perceived oppressors. What this results in is the creation of a culture where meaning, truth, and progress, the progress of the Enlightenment project, are destroyed and replaced with moral relativism, anti-realism, and ultimately, nihilism. The difficulty is the textual evidence with which Hicks uses to construct his argument is alarmingly thin. I'm going to start at the end, so to speak, by examining Hicks' bibliography and just where he is getting the information he uses to explain postmodernism. Hicks' bibliography boasts over 230 sources, but it's how he deploys these sources that merits scrutiny. Of the 233 listed sources, 26 are either written by or about one of these postmodern theorists. I'll be referring to these as direct sources. That's 11%. There are 28 additional supplementary texts discussing either broader issues related to or critiques of postmodernism, or are given as examples of deconstruction. So that's a total of 54 texts, or 23% of the bibliography. So, in a book about postmodernism, over 75% of the sources have nothing to do with the topic. But it gets worse. Of these 28 supplementary sources, 9 are never cited in the text itself, only appearing in the bibliography. There are a total of 320 footnotes. 38 of these footnotes, 12%, are from those direct sources I mentioned, and the supplementary texts provide 24 additional footnotes, another 8%. So altogether, only 20% of all citations in the text purport to be about postmodernism. Now, given how much ink Hicks spills developing his idiosyncratic narrative of the descent of the Enlightenment and the fall of communism, that the book's sources are so weighted is unsurprising. Still, as the subject of the book is ostensibly postmodernism, this seems inadequate. The version of the text I will be examining is the original 2004 edition published by Scholargy, so all of my citations and references will correspond to that version. I have also examined the expanded 2011 edition, and while there are some changes, none of them have any bearing on what the majority of this analysis will focus on. I will be talking about the expanded edition in the conclusion, and if you want to see the changes, you can find a link to a document called Appendix A in the description, but more on that later. Next, I'd like to examine the citations from listed sources of the primary villains of the narrative, Hicks' Postmodern Vanguard: Jean-François Lyotard, Jacques Derrida, Richard Rorty, and Michel Foucault. What follows is an examination of each of the postmodern theorists Hicks uses to construct his narrative. There's a breakdown of the texts and citations from or about each theorist used by Hicks, then a brief discussion of where each theorist fits in Hicks' model. This is followed by a close reading of one citation from each theorist, after which we should be able to make a hypothesis on Hicks' academic process. For the sake of time, I've limited each theorist to a single citation, but have also included a link in the description to a document, Appendix A, Hicks Citations, which will have a full accounting of all 38 direct citations from or about the Postmodern Vanguard. Let's get started. I've started with Lyotard because he is the postmodern theorist whose presence is least felt in the text. This is an incredibly bizarre choice. Hicks' treatment of Lyotard is truly odd. He almost always appears in the company of others. Of the 11 times Lyotard's name appears in the body of the text, and one footnote, 9 of them are with another postmodernist. And when he does cite him individually, it's in blatant misreadings, as on page 4, something noted by Čeika. As an example, on page 183, Hicks has footnote 11, where he makes the claim that placing pain and suffering at the center of morality is a recurring theme among the leading postmodernists. Lyotard, expressing agreement with Foucault, states that one has to bear witness to the dissonance, especially that of others. Now, this is a very telling example of Hicks' citation style because he has selected a total of 3 words spread out over 3 pages of Lyotard's The Differend. The relevant text on page 13 is about philosophy in the face of its adversaries, economics and academics. And the task of philosophy is to create a philosophy of politics apart from intellectuals and politicians. We must bear witness to the differend. Hicks has also translated differend to dissonance for some reason, even though Lyotard uses dissonance elsewhere in the text, so they don't mean the same thing. The differend, the subject of the book, is, according to Lyotard, the unstable state and instant of language wherein something which must be able to be put into phrases cannot yet be. Pages 140 to 141 occur in the context of a chapter about Lyotard's conception of genre, how he differentiates types of language games. And in the section where the words Hicks quotes appear, on page 141, Lyotard is talking about politics being deployed as a genre, which results in misunderstandings because politics is not really a genre but a combination of genres. The bearing witness is to the nothingness produced by each new Lyotardian phrase. None of these citations mentions suffering, nor comes close to talking about supporting marginalized individuals or groups, as they are about the constitution of language. So one must wonder why Hicks chose to cite these pages and not others, which demonstrates Lyotard making the claim Hicks subscribes to him. Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge, is arguably the singular reason that postmodern theorists have come to be named so, as this work popularized the association of the term in the discourses of theory. Out of the other members of Hicks' vanguard, Lyotard is the only one who unambiguously adopted the postmodernist label. Hicks lists the postmodern condition in his sources, but he never cites from it. He does, however, talk directly about a crisis of epistemology and provides responses from Heidegger, Foucault, Derrida, and Rorty, and later on page 83 lists three emergent but brutal postmodern social worlds following arguments from Foucault, Derrida, and Rorty. So why did he ignore the singular figure of his postmodern vanguard, the one who wrote a seminal text on the state of knowledge in postmodernity, in this account? Why, in fact, does Hicks never mention anything about postmodernity, about the particular kind of material or epistemic conditions which developed in the late 20th century that prompted Lyotard to write the postmodern condition in the first place? It is very strange that Lyotard's defining characteristic of postmodernity, incredulity towards meta-narratives, appears nowhere in this text. Well, this is because such a framing of postmodernism is in dispute with Hicks' conspiratorial model, as it provides an alternative reasoning for the emergence of postmodern theory. Lyotard's conception most notably reinforces a rejection of the narrative function of Marxism, as Marx and Engels' model of the inevitable proletarian revolution was precisely one of the meta-narratives which Lyotard was skeptical about. While Lyotard has the distinction of being the most marginalized of Hicks' vanguard, he also comes off somewhat better than the remaining members. If Lyotard's marginalization is understood to be odd, then the treatment of Derrida is downright baffling. Deconstruction, as I noted earlier, is what Hicks considers the chief intellectual strategy through which postmodern theorists have been able to assail reason and reality. Derrida is the figure who popularized and disseminated deconstruction throughout the academy, so you would assume that he'd rank higher in citations and attributions. But you'd be wrong. Derrida is cited 5 times in the text, 2 of which are the same quotation. Now, this repeated quote is interesting, because unlike Lyotard, Hicks does actually cite Derrida talking about deconstruction. The quote appears on page 5, and again on page 186. Deconstruction never had meaning or interest, at least in my eyes, than as a radicalization, that is to say, also within the tradition of a certain Marxism and a certain spirit of Marxism. In Hicks' signature citational style, he has conveniently removed any and all context from this quote to fit his narrative. But then again, that requires actually reading the text in question. You see, Hicks lists 2 sources for this quote. One is Derrida, in 1995, a text called Moscow aller-retour, usually translated into English as Back from Moscow in the USSR, but you will note that he does not provide a page number. Right next to it, however, is a second citation, Mark Lila's 1998 essay, The Politics of Jacques Derrida, which does have a page number. Curious. What's even more curious is that Moscow aller-retour has never been translated into English, yet here we have Hicks supposedly quoting directly from it. Well, as it turns out, he's done no such thing and has displayed no indication that he's actually read the book. This is because Hicks directly lifted the quote from Lila, saw Lila had attributed it to Back from Moscow, and simply included it in his bibliography. The problem is that Lila made a mistake. This nostalgic note is struck time and again in Spectres of Marx and Moscow aller-retour, which deserve permanent places in the crowded pantheon of bizarre Marxist apologetics. In the latter book, Derrida declares that deconstruction never had meaning or interest, at least in my eyes, than as a radicalization, that is to say, also within the tradition of a certain Marxism, in a certain spirit of Marxism. Lila meant to write that this quote is from Derrida's Spectres of Marx, page 115 to be precise, not Back from Moscow, but mixed up the order of the book in his essay. It's an easy enough mistake to make. But it's not like Hicks also listed specters in his bibliography or listed any citations from it. Oops. I mean, Hicks' citation is from page 14, so maybe he just didn't get far enough into it to catch the mistake. So then, where does that leave us? Well, our sources from Derrida are now down from 3 to 2, and I think it is fair to say that of these 2, Hicks has demonstrated that he did not read with anything approaching thoroughness. This is a consistent problem with Hicks' readings, because I think it is safe to say that Hicks did read Lila, but somehow missed this important proviso, which follows directly after the quote. With statements like these, Jacques Derrida risks giving bad faith a bad name. The simple truth is that his thinking has nothing to do with Marx or Marxism. The thing is that the context within which Derrida made this statement was at the 1993 Whither Marxism conference, which was later compiled into Spectres. What Derrida is talking about is the intellectual climate of 1950s France, which Hicks does discuss, but then twists this ellagic reminiscence of Marxism in a chapter where a few pages before, Derrida exclaimed that every man, woman, and child was, in a certain sense, an heir to Marx and Marxism, which, it needs be said, Lila quotes directly below where Hicks pulled the quote he uses from. As harsh as Lila's judgment is, I don't believe it to be an unfair reading of Derrida, and that the quote is not some secret confession giving away the long game of postmodernism, but a sentimentalism which is belied by Derrida's oeuvre. One of the criticisms leveled against Čeika's response video was that he was too vitriolic, too uncivil, and clearly acting in bad faith.
My biased instinct was that cuck philosophy was deliberately misrepresenting things to push an agenda in a typically postmodern way.
I'm not sure, then, what level of faith one needs to operate on to make the kinds of claims Hicks does, while having read so little of the figures he's using to construct his hypothesis. Maybe Hicks will have better luck with Rorty. Rorty is the odd man out in many ways. He's not French, he was never a Marxist or socialist of any kind, and emerged from the analytic side of the philosophical divide. This lack of a connection to socialist bona fides doesn't stop Hicks from calling Rorty a member of the far left, nor from trying to shoehorn him into his conspiratorial model by mentioning that Rorty's parents were employed by, and Rorty himself was a fan of, Union leader A. Philip Randolph. On the other hand, Rorty does have a reputation for making deliberately provocative statements and being comfortable, if isolated, in the maelstrom. I would argue that it is this reputation which resulted in Rorty being the second most called upon member of the Vanguard, cited 14 times from among 7 direct sources. Rorty has also made much more explicit overtures to occupying an anti-realist position than the other members of Hicks' Vanguard. So let us turn to page 176. Hicks is comparing the modernist versus postmodernist approach to language. For the postmodernist, language cannot be cognitive because it does not connect to reality, whether to an external nature or an underlying self. Language is not about being aware of the world or about distinguishing the true from the false, or even about argument in the traditional sense of validity, soundness, and probability. Accordingly, postmodernism recasts the nature of rhetoric. Rhetoric is persuasion in the absence of cognition. And then to justify this statement, Hicks cites Rorty on page 177. Richard Rorty makes this point clear in his essay, The Contingency of Language. The failure of the realist position, Rorty argues, has shown that the world does not tell us what language games to play, and that human languages are human creations. One of the realizations that begins to emerge as you compare Hicks' citations with the works he is citing is that he is simply incapable of presenting anything approaching an accurate sense of the author's words. In this instance, Hicks has taken a quote from page 6 and placed it before another quote from pages 4 to 5. Why does he do this? This is the full paragraph that Hicks has pulled the Human Languages or Human Creations quote from. See if you can spot where he misses the mark. We need to make a distinction between the claim that the world is out there and the claim that truth is out there. To say that the world is out there, that it is not our creation, is to say, with common sense, that most things in space and time are the effects of causes which do not include human mental states. To say that truth is not out there is simply to say that where there are no sentences, there is no truth. That sentences are elements of human languages, and that human languages are human creations. And this is the paragraph which follows immediately afterward. Truth cannot be out there, cannot exist independently of the human mind, because sentences cannot so exist, or be out there. The world is out there, but the descriptions of the world are not. Only descriptions of the world can be true or false. The world on its own, unaided by the describing activities of human beings, cannot. So Rorty accepts that you can speak about claims and evaluate their truth or falsity, but only that this necessarily occurs within the confines of human language, that to postulate the values of true and false outside of language make no sense. If we then turn to the part of the quote from page 6, once again, presented in its totality. The world does not speak, only we do. The world can, once we have programmed ourselves with language, cause us to hold beliefs, but it cannot propose a language for us to speak. Only other human beings can do that. The realization that the world does not tell us what language games to play should not, however, lead us to say that a decision about which to play is arbitrary, nor to say that it is the expression of something deep within us. The moral is not that objective criteria for choice of vocabulary are to be replaced with subjective criteria, reason with will or feeling. It is rather that the notions of criteria and choice, including that of arbitrary choice, are no longer in point when it comes to change from one language game to another. Europe did not decide to accept the idiom of romantic poetry or of socialist politics or of Galilean mechanics. That sort of shift was no more an act of will than it was a result of argument. Rather, Europe gradually lost the habit of using certain words and gradually acquired the habit of using others. So once again, Hicks is quoted from within a sentence, no ellipses to indicate this, of course, which changes the context of the quote. Seeing that Hicks' central argument is about the postmodernist rejection of objective reason for subjective feeling, it is embarrassing to have such a position contradicted immediately following your quote proving the case. The reason Hicks continues to do this throughout the text is that he never takes the time to present the arguments of the postmodern theorists in anything except caricature. Because if you present an argument your readers can engage with, they may actually choose to do so, and may then arrive at a different conclusion than the one presented. In this case, Hicks claimed that postmodernists reject the very possibility of cognition. But Rorty clearly states that observations of the world can cause us to hold beliefs. Hicks, rather than presenting Rorty's full argument, chops it into small pieces and reconstitutes it to prove his own position. Again, calling this bad faith implies that there was the possibility of honesty to begin with. So let's finish up with Hicks' definitive postmodern theorist. Foucault appears in the text almost twice as frequently as Rorty, over 2 times as often as Derrida, and 4 times that of Lyotard. To say that Foucault occupies the position of leader of the vanguard in Hicks' accounting of the development of postmodern theory would be an understatement. But then again, considering just how massive Foucault's academic footprint is, this is an understandable choice. The problem with Hicks' account of Foucault, unfortunately, becomes apparent when you consider how two-dimensional Hicks' representation of his thoughts are. Rather than examining Foucault throughout his career with the significant shifts between his early, middle, and later works, Hicks instead focuses on a handful of statements to present an image of Foucault which is remarkably static. Yet it is once again in service to Hicks' narrative, his caricature of these postmodern theorists as manipulative, ultimately Machiavellian political actors, that Hicks reveals his own manipulations. Every accusation is a confession. Take, for example, this section from page 187. In adopting this rhetorical strategy, do you really need to believe that everything is a matter of opinion or merely semantics? No, you do not. You can believe absolutely that you are right about the politics, and you can know that all you want to do is to use words to get the guy off your back in a way that makes it seem like you have not lost the argument. To then demonstrate the shiftless nature of his postmodern opponents, Hicks then invokes Foucault. This rhetorical strategy also works at the level of intellectual movements. Foucault has identified the strategy explicitly and clearly. Discourses are tactical elements, or blocks, operating in the field of force relations. There can exist different and even contradictory discourses within the same strategy. Lacking any content whatsoever, you'd be forgiven for believing that Foucault was in fact providing a lesson on rhetorical strategy for arguing the case for postmodern theory. Would you then be surprised that Foucault is, in fact, writing about how discourse itself functions as a means to establish knowledge? I'm going to be honest, at this point, you shouldn't be. The quote comes from pages 101 to 102 of Chapter 2 of the fourth part of Volume 1 of The History of Sexuality. Chapter 2, Method, first outlines Foucault's model for how power functions, and then relating to the issue of truth in sexuality, why power needs to establish a knowledge of sexuality at all. Foucault then advances 4 rules to follow to answer this question, and Hicks has pulled this quote from the fourth and final of Foucault's prescriptions. Rule 4 is titled Rule of the Tactical Polyvalence of Discourse, and outlines how power and knowledge are joined together in discourse. To be more precise, we must not imagine a world of discourse divided between accepted discourse and excluded discourse, or between the dominant discourse and the dominated one, but as a multiplicity of discursive elements that can come into play in various strategies. So, according to this work that Hicks cited, just one page back, at the start of the section the quote is from, Foucault is advocating that reducing power relations to a binary between dominant and dominated is mistaken? But wasn't this binary the entire foundation upon which Hicks has built his conspiratorial model? The switching out of the defunct Marxist dichotomy of bourgeoisie and proletariat for gender, racial, and sexual identity groups? Of course, Foucault isn't talking about identity groups at all, but rather how discourse itself operates. And so we return to the quote in question, presented in context. Apologies, it is long, but necessary to show just how much Hicks has distorted what Foucault was addressing. There is no question that the appearance in 19th century psychiatry, jurisprudence, and literature of a whole series of discourses on the species and subspecies of homosexuality, inversion, pederasty, and psychic hermaphrodism made possible a strong advance of social controls into this area of perversity. But it also made possible the formation of a reverse discourse. Homosexuality began to speak in its own behalf, to demand that its legitimacy or naturality be acknowledged, often in the same vocabulary, using the same categories by which it was medically disqualified. There is not, on one side, a discourse of power, and opposite it, another discourse that runs counter to it. Discourses are tactical elements or blocks operating in the field of force relations. There can exist different and even contradictory discourses within the same strategy. They can, on the contrary, circulate without changing their form from one strategy to another, opposing strategy. We must not expect the discourses on sex to tell us, above all, what strategy they derive from, or what moral divisions they accompany, or what ideology, dominant or dominated, they represent. Rather, we must question them on the two levels of their tactical productivity, what reciprocal effects of power and knowledge they ensure, and their strategical integration, what conjunction and what force relationship make their utilization necessary in a given episode of the various confrontations that occur. So far from advocating a strategy for engaging in a rhetorical ploy to trap your ideological opponents, Foucault is outlining how discourse itself shapes the development of knowledge, in this instance, the emergence of discourses on homosexuality during the 19th century. He then explains how the emergence of this field of knowledge both made possible social controls, but also provided the generative basis for homosexuality to speak on its own accord using the very same categories. Thus, discourses of power are not something which are merely a binary between oppressors and oppressed, as Hicks would have it, but discourses are tactical elements, or blocks, operating in the field of force relations. There can exist different and even contradictory discourses within the same strategy. Suffice it to say that Hicks latches onto the presence of the words discourses, tactical, and strategy to elicit a specific reaction in the reader, given how he has framed the inclusion of Foucault's quote in his wider point about the duplicitous nature of postmodern rhetorical strategy. What Hicks has revealed about his own writing, his unique rhetorical strategy, is that he is in no way opposed to the deliberate manipulation of source material to argue whatever point he feels he must. Throughout this section, I have asked a number of what are ultimately rhetorical questions. Why did Hicks not talk about this work he listed? Why did Hicks not confirm this citation? Why does Hicks ignore evidence which directly contradicts the statements he just made? Why is Hicks incapable of accurately presenting any of these theorists? With these questions in mind, I think I can make my first hypothesis about explaining postmodernism. Explaining postmodernism emerged out of Hicks' careless scholarship, itself owing to his utter contempt for the subject he purports to be explaining. And so I ask this question. If this is the caliber of argument that Hicks has chosen to rely on to make his case, if this is the level of academic rigor Hicks is willing to expend in pursuit of his own ideological project, if this is what has been left in Hicks' account of postmodernism, then what has he left out? I've covered who Hicks considers as the most significant figures in the development of postmodern theory, but let's consider for a moment another candidate, one who, unlike the four figures Hicks centers his arguments on, unambiguously fits his criteria. Let's talk about Jean Baudrillard. Marxist, the three earliest of Baudrillard's published works, The System of Objects, The Consumer Society, and For a Critique of the Political Economy of the Sign, are all heavily influenced and dependent on Marxist theory. A clear anti-realist position, Baudrillard has published several texts on the subject of anti-realism, including Simulacra and Simulation, The Gulf War Did Not Take Place, and The Perfect Crime, a book about the literal murder of reality. He came of age in France during the right time. Baudrillard was born in Rennes, northern France, on the 27th of July, 1929. Baudrillard was a contemporary of Derrida, Foucault, and Lyotard. Baudrillard was heavily influenced by the works of Michel Foucault. Wrote about postmodernism. Baudrillard has been called, among other things, the high priest of postmodernism. Advocated nihilism. Baudrillard wrote an essay called On Nihilism, where he declares in no uncertain terms that he is a nihilist. Baudrillard, then, in all the ways which matter to Hicks, fits into the Postmodern Vanguard better than the other members of this group. So why then was Baudrillard totally absent from Hicks' account? My assumption is that Hicks would argue that Baudrillard does not have the same academic footprint as other members of the Vanguard, and at least as far as Foucault, with 1,351,372, and Derrida, 396,892 citations, go, that's certainly true. But if we're comparing Baudrillard to Lyotard or Rorty, then the picture becomes more equitable. According to the author's profile page on Google Scholar, Baudrillard is presently sitting at 199,318 citations. Lyotard, by contrast, has only 129,852. And Rorty, well, he doesn't have a Google Scholar profile, so we'll have to look at individual works. His most cited work is Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, sitting at 21,781 citations, whereas Baudrillard's most cited work, Simulacra and Simulation, is sitting at 23,762. So I think a reasonable case could be made that Baudrillard has as large, if not slightly larger, academic footprint when compared to both Lyotard and Rorty. These numbers should also reinforce just how strange Hicks' decision to heavily cite Rorty over Derrida is. There are some other reasons, of course, and that I'm sure any viewers familiar with Baudrillard are aware of. Baudrillard's early works were heavily influenced by Marxism, but his fourth text, The Mirror of Production, was an overt criticism of Marx and Marxism, far more overt than anything published by Derrida or Foucault. Baudrillard was influenced by Foucault, but he also published a text which was received as a scathing critique of the thinker, Forget Foucault, which elided such responses from the otherwise affable Gilles Deleuze as to call Baudrillard the shame of the profession. Baudrillard was also heavily influenced by and influential in the development of post-structuralism, and while it may be argued that some of his earlier works were deconstructive, his work post-Forget Foucault had moved well beyond deconstruction. And, perhaps, most fundamental of all, Baudrillard's self-identification as a postmodernist has been at best ambivalent and at worst, well, in an interview with Truls Lie in 2000, Baudrillard stated, "To me, nihilism is a good thing. I am a nihilist, not a postmodernist." Now, this may all seem clearly disqualifying if you are an author who is constructing an argument about adherence to these theoretical positions, except the same kind of arguments can be made about at least three of Hicks' vanguard. Foucault and Derrida also took an ambivalent position on their membership as postmodernists. Rorty, on the other hand, has been critical of postmodernism and French theory in general. Lyotard, as has been mentioned elsewhere, is the only one of Hicks' vanguard who consistently wrote about postmodernism. But then, Hicks had already marginalized Lyotard, so then it would be odd to exclude Baudrillard on these positions. No, I think a far more significant reason for Baudrillard's exclusion can be traced to Hicks' vague and fundamentally unsubstantiated explanations for what postmodern theory encompasses. This is because Baudrillard's writings on, let's call them, the themes of postmodernity are neither based in Foucauldian power relations nor in deconstruction. Rather, Baudrillard observes that there has been a sea change through the operations of signs, through hypermediation, the disappearance of the subject, and the ultimate erosion of the metaphysical principle of reality. The reality that has invented itself over recent centuries and which we have elevated into a principle is now dying. To wish to revive it at all costs as a reference or a moral value is a mistake, since the principle is dead. What we see now, behind the eclipse of the objective real, is the rise of integral reality, of a virtual reality that rests on the deregulation of the very reality principle. Let us be clear about this. When we say reality has disappeared, the point is not that it has disappeared physically, but that it has disappeared metaphysically. Reality continues to exist. It is the principle that is dead. Because Baudrillard's approach is so heavily predicated on developments with signs and images refracted through post-war hypermediation, it would have been too difficult for Hicks to attempt to integrate him into his failed Marxism conspiracy theory. Baudrillard then represents an alternative genesis and model of postmodern theory, one which emerged not through a crisis of Marxism or epistemology, but one which emerged as a response to the incredibly rapid technologization engendered through late capitalism. And with this in mind, it is worth mentioning that Baudrillard isn't the only notable absence in Hicks' account. As a general strategy for reading a text, particularly on a subject one is familiar with, jumping to the index or bibliography can give you a reasonable grasp of the content of the book you're about to read, as it succinctly displays the kind of dialogue the author will be engaging with. So while I was initially disappointed that Baudrillard was totally absent from the text, I was downright confused when it came to Frederic Jameson. Jameson, a Marxist scholar who has written extensively on postmodernism, who emerged as one of the most prominent voices on the topic during the 1990s, and who remains a highly respected and influential writer, also wrote what is considered one of the most seminal texts on the subject of postmodernism, or the cultural logic of late capitalism. It was, as it happens, one of the 5 books I mentioned at the outset of this video. So when Jameson's name appears twice in the index, on pages 85 and 186 respectively, and the only text listed in the bibliography is The Political Unconscious, and not Postmodernism or the Logic of Late Capitalism, well, it raises some red flags. So, the first time Jameson is mentioned in the text on page 85, Hicks says this: "Part of the something else is that postmodernists have taken to heart Frederic Jameson's remark that everything is, in the last analysis, political. The spirit of Jameson's remark lies behind the persistent postmodernist charge that epistemology is merely a tool of power, that all claims of objectivity and rationality mask oppressive political agendas." Why Hicks has chosen to invoke Jameson here is unclear, but perhaps the second reference will shine some light on his thought process. On page 186, Hicks also says this: "So let us try the second option, that postmodernism is first about politics and only secondly about relativistic epistemology. Frederic Jameson's oft-quoted line, 'Everything is, in the last analysis, political,' should then be given a strongly Machiavellian twist as a statement of willingness to use any weapon, rhetorical, epistemological, political, to achieve political ends." Oh, so it's the exact same quote as appeared earlier, but at least it clearly shows why Hicks needed to invoke Jameson in these 2 instances, right? The Political Unconscious, Narrative is a Socially Symbolic Act, a text written by Jameson in 1982, is an examination of the ways existing narrative frameworks have already impacted the way a text is read. As Jameson notes in the preface, the political unconscious, accordingly, turns on the dynamics of the act of interpretation and presupposes, as its organizational function, that we never really confront a text immediately, in all its freshness, as a thing in itself. So while Jameson does mention the postmodern occasionally through the text, it is always couched in terms of its relation as an emergent historic period, rather than as a coherent political or philosophical ideology. In fact, this book is not really about the postmodern at all. So let's turn to the quote Hicks is citing. It's from page 20 of the first chapter on interpretation. The quote Hicks uses concludes a paragraph wherein Jameson is discussing the lack of meaningful difference between a text understood as social or political and a text that is not. He concludes the paragraph thusly: "The only effective liberation from such constraint begins with the recognition that there is nothing that is not social and historical. Indeed, that everything is, in the last analysis, political." Which is followed by this sentence, which ties the statements back into the topic of the book. The assertion of a political unconscious proposes that we undertake just such a final analysis and explore the multiple paths that lead to the unmasking of cultural artifacts in socially symbolic acts. So, Jameson here is speaking about interpreting texts, a hermeneutical approach to textual analysis. And so how does this contextualizing match up with Hicks' deployment of the quote? Hicks, in both instances, has a quite different understanding of this line, particularly when he claims that it should be understood to reflect a strongly Machiavellian twist, that postmodern theorists will deploy any and all intellectual weapons to achieve their political ends. Hicks' efforts to contort and twist a statement about the nature of interpreting cultural texts into the spirit undergirding the frightening strategies of the postmodernist political project is truly heroic. It's totally wrong, of course, but it should be beyond clear by this point that accurately and honestly representing the authors he uses to construct his arguments is very low on the list of Hicks' priorities. Rather, the inclusion of this text and this quote reveals something about Hicks' thought process, as we have already observed in the exclusion of Baudrillard. There is an aphorism about filmmaking which seems appropriate here. You should never show a better film inside your own, and here Hicks' choices are revealing. Jameson's Postmodernism text is one of the most interesting and influential written on the topic. That it does not appear in the bibliography is, as I have said before, very strange. Why wouldn't you quote from Jameson's seminal text on the topic you are yourself writing about? Well, it speaks to two central aspects of Jameson's work. The first is that Jameson, as Baudrillard before him, provides an accounting of postmodernity which exists well outside the scope of Hicks' model. Jameson, as the title suggests, posits the emergence of the postmodern, or of postmodernity specifically, having occurred as a result of changes in material conditions and ideological developments in what he calls late capitalism, or, more broadly, the neoliberal turn. Mandel's book Late Capitalism changed all that, and for the first time theorized a third stage of capitalism from a usably Marxist perspective. This is what made my own thoughts on postmodernism possible, and they are therefore to be understood as an attempt to theorize the specific logic of the cultural production of that third stage, and not as yet another disembodied culture critique or diagnosis of the spirit of the age. It's something I'll be discussing in greater detail at the conclusion of this video, but Hicks' explanation for the origins and purpose of postmodern theory emerging from the crises of Marxism is anathema to any alternative explanations. So, in this vein, it makes complete sense that Hicks would not cite from postmodernism, because doing so would undercut his own narrative. This then begs the question as to why you would include Jameson at all, since Hicks has effectively kept any generalized texts on postmodernism to an absolute minimum, the two Lyotard texts, only one of which is actually cited. And the second aspect of Jameson's work, which Hicks needs to obscure for his model to maintain the appearance of feasibility, is that Jameson has, since the 1970s and throughout the rest of his career, been a Marxist. If Baudrillard's absence was necessitated by the need to exclude a preeminent postmodern theorist because he operates outside the model you've established, and Jameson's marginalization can be understood as being necessitated by the need to avoid alternative origins for the emergence of the conditions of postmodernity, then the choice to construct your case around the failures and retreat of Marxism in the academy in the 1950s and 60s is truly straining credulity. For an intelligent, informed socialist confronted with the data of history, a crisis of belief has to occur. Socialism is to many a powerful vision of the beautiful society, one that envisages an ideal social world that will transcend all the ills of our current one. Any such deeply held vision comes to form part of the very identity of the believer, and any threat to the vision has to be experienced as a threat to the believer. Anyone unfamiliar with the development of Marxist thought post-New Left would be forgiven for simply taking Hicks' account at face value. The problem is, of course, that Hicks provides very little in the way of evidence for the supposed retreat of Marxist academics, which necessitated the development of postmodern theory. Jameson, after all, had been pioneering Marxist literary criticism since the 1970s, something which occurred so late because the crucial intellectual fact about the United States then and now is the utter absence of anything like what we would come to call Western Marxism later on. My own contribution as, in books like Marxism and Form, to make that tradition known. Marxism in the American campus, having been heavily censored by the state on anti-communist grounds during the 1950s and early 1960s, only really emerged through the developments of the New Left in the late 1960s and early 1970s. In fact, one of Jameson's earliest books, Marxism in Form, which was published in 1971, was his first foray into theorizing what would come to be known as postmodernism, albeit, at the time, he referred to it as new modernism. So, this idea that Marxism, or academics committed to the socialist project, were persona non grata in the academy during the 1970s and 1980s, when postmodernism was in its ascendancy, is simply untrue. What's more, this purposeful absentia in Hicks' account also hides one of the most damning reversals of Hicks' thesis. Academic Marxists were the harshest critics of postmodern theory. Some of the most scathing critiques of postmodernism were written by Marxists, including Dave Harvey's The Conditions of Postmodernity, Jürgen Habermas's lecture series, The Philosophical Discourses of Modernity, where he was highly critical of figures like Derrida, Lyotard, and Foucault, just about anything Terry Eagleton has had to say on the subject, and even critics Hicks himself cites in his book, like Alan Sokol. But why did I do it? I confess that I'm an unabashed old leftist who never quite understood how deconstruction was supposed to help the working class. In 1997, Ellen Miskins Wood and John Bellamy Foster published In Defense of History, Marxism and the Postmodern Agenda. And while the subtitle could very well have been an alternate for Hicks' own text, the content couldn't be more different. The book collects essays by prominent Marxist thinkers like Jameson, Eagleton, Wood, Foster, Keenan Malik, and a bevy of others. As should be apparent, the text presents a number of critiques of postmodern theory from a Marxist framework, but the core thesis of the text is laid out in Wood's introductory essay, What is the Postmodern Agenda? In fact, politics, in any traditional sense of the word, having to do with the overarching power of classes or states and opposition to them, is effectively ruled out, giving way to the fractured struggle of identity politics, or even the personal as political. Although there are more universal projects that do hold some attraction for the postmodern left, such as environmental politics, it is difficult to see how they, or indeed any political action, can be consistent with postmodernism's most fundamental principle, a deep epistemological skepticism and a profound political defeatism. Anyone who is at all familiar with contemporary Marxist discourse would be aware of the critiques of what has come to be called identity politics. And so Hicks equivocating between a Marxist or socialist position and a liberal one is only possible because Hicks' idiosyncratic definition of the left encompasses everyone on that side of Ayn Rand. Furthermore, this also completely ignores the fact that more broadly leftist critiques of postmodern theory have attempted to place it not on the left, but rather as an outgrowth of late capitalism itself, as noted by Foster. History, as centuries of struggle and indeed progress suggest, is more meaningful than that. To abandon altogether the concept of progress, in the more general sense of the possibility of progressive human emancipation, would only be to submit to the wishes of the powers that be. Such political disengagement by intellectuals on the left in the present epoch could only mean one thing: the total obeisance to capital. I touched on it briefly when examining Derrida, but to bring it back around, even in the face of these so-called crises of Marxism, which occurred with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, the sheer amount of criticism emerging from the left and left academics, especially when postmodern theory was arguably at its apex, has always been the majority of published critique. A perfect example is this Reddit post from 2019 in r Ask Philosophy, where someone was asking what was wrong with Hicks' book, as it seems to be the only widely available non-Marxist critique of postmodernism. So then, if the majority of voices writing against postmodern theory were academic Marxists themselves, then Hicks' conspiratorial model is wholly without substance. There was never a crisis of faith among academic Marxists, necessitating a need to try to slip Marxism or socialism into the academy through postmodernism because such a strategy lacks any kind of utility. Being a Marxist in the academy in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s was not the ideological barrier Hicks claims that it was, as evidenced by the rather successful careers of the Marxist thinkers I've talked about in this section. So, with this final examination of the last excluded group from Hicks' account, I believe I can now offer a second hypothesis about explaining postmodernism. Explaining postmodernism is Stephen Hicks' rhetorical strategy to present postmodern theory as poorly as possible, necessitated by his failure to engage with postmodernism's powerful arguments. If Hicks' account misrepresents the theorists he has included, and excludes those who provide alternative accounts of postmodernism, then the question needs to be asked: what does Hicks have to gain from this account? When I was in the early phases of making this video, when I was thinking about what kind of visual metaphor to use when presenting Hicks' Postmodern Vanguard, I was initially going to go with paper dolls. Paper dolls are flimsy, two-dimensional, and easy to manipulate. But the more I thought about it, the more I began to doubt the suitability of the metaphor. You see, while paper dolls are as easy to manipulate as they are to tear apart, they also require a necessary level of dynamism, of energy. They need an animating force to move. This is something Hicks was simply unable to provide. So I chose instead to go with cardboard cutouts. They are also two-dimensional and can be toppled with the slightest of breezes, but they are also static, unmoving, unchanging, able to provide a solitary statement before being pushed over. This is the level of scholastic rigor with which Hicks operates. For Hicks' model to maintain even a semblance of cohesion, he must treat postmodern theory as a unified political project, a singularly coherent theory that remains static and unchanging for a period of some 40 years, and within which his theorists are unable to develop or change. This is why Hicks' representations of postmodern theory only ever approach, but never reaches, caricature. Curious, then, that he also makes statements like this found on page 21. Postmodernism, therefore, is a comprehensive philosophical and cultural movement. It identifies its target, modernism and its realization in the Enlightenment and its legacy, and it mounts powerful arguments against all of these essential elements of modernism. Have any of Hicks' representations of postmodern theory come anywhere close to mounting a powerful argument? No, they haven't. In the episode of Hicks' podcast where he responds to the Multiversity Project, he provides an answer to a question that they had asked. Why did Hicks include Andrea Dworkin and Catherine MacKinnon in his account of postmodern theory? Both were, after all, vocal opponents of postmodernism. Hicks' reasoning is as follows. Both MacKinnon and Dworkin are radical feminists. And radical feminism also attacks the idea of the modern universal subject, and so ought to be included among postmodernists. And while this is incredibly revealing, it is something that's reflected in the text itself, as Hicks notes on pages 10 to 11. The weakening and overthrow of the feudal regimes then made possible the practical extension of liberal individualist ideas to all human beings. Racism and sexism are obvious affronts to individualism, and so had been increasingly on the defensive as the 18th century progressed. For the first time ever in history, societies were formed for the elimination of slavery. In America in 1784, in England in 1787, and a year later in France. And 1791 and 1792 saw the publication of Olympe de Gouges' Declaration of the Rights of Women, and Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women, landmarks in the push for women's liberty and equality. For Hicks, race relations and feminism reached their zenith in the abolitionist movement and the proto-feminism of Wollstonecraft. Anything which followed was, sadly, counter-enlightenment, descending until finally emerging in the 1960s as Hicks' great boogeyman, identity politics, as he notes on page 152. Left thinkers and activists focused on narrower subdivisions of the human species, concentrating their efforts on the special issues of women and of racial and ethnic minorities. So then, if second-wave feminism and the civil rights movement is to be regarded with suspicion as manifestations of counter-Enlightenment irrationality, suddenly the exclusion of postmodern feminists like Julia Kristeva and Luce Irigaray and the inclusion of Dworkin and McKinnon make perfect sense. Hicks is, if nothing else, deeply invested in misrepresenting postmodern theory as much as possible. And so, while Dworkin is decidedly not a postmodernist of any kind, her infamy stems from her salacious and vitriolic statements, all the better to use to make the case that postmodern theory isn't worth engaging with. I've mentioned, and Hicks himself has admitted, that his interpretation of all but a handful of the Enlightenment thinkers he discusses is not a widely held one. His insistence that modernist theories like Marxism or political projects like socialism or communism were in fact anti-modern, perhaps even postmodern, is totally at odds with how modernism has broadly been defined by the very same postmodern theorists Hicks talks about. These kind of grand narratives are explicitly what Lyotard was speaking about when he wrote, simplifying to the extreme, I define postmodernism as incredulity toward meta-narratives. But a modernism, an enlightenment, which presents as its model for the universal human subject an atomized, hyper-individualist who loves and acknowledges how great everything is under capitalism, it's the Randian ideal. The version of the book which appears on Amazon, the one which I referenced at the start of the video, is the audiobook. And you know who published this version? The Atlas Society. Would you also be surprised to learn that the Atlas Society has produced a pocket version of Hicks' book? That in their former life as the Institute for Objectivist Studies, Hicks presented in a 1998 seminar the core analysis which would form the basis of this book, which outlined the core objectivist tenets needed to rejuvenate the Enlightenment spirit. I mentioned it earlier, but I think it bears repeating. Every accusation is a confession. The intended audience for this book are people who have heard about something called postmodernism, and in seeking out information will inevitably come across this book. Hicks and the Atlas Society behind him are counting on it. Hicks admits that he doesn't actually engage with postmodern theory in this text, that he hasn't done anything to refute postmodernism. The trick is that in order to achieve his goal, to normalize the Randian position, he doesn't have to. Instead, Hicks has created a narrative which casts postmodern theory as a sinister conspiracy, a position which avoids engagement and instead delegitimizes postmodern theory before any potential reader can interrogate it on its own terms. One of the most revealing reviews of Explaining Postmodernism, one of many Hicks features on his own webpage, was from a 2005 review by the Ludwig von Mises Institute's Marcus Virha, where he noted, students with little knowledge of modern philosophy who are likely to be swayed by Hicks' readings of key modern figures are decidedly not a proper audience for this work, except outside the context of a classroom setting where Hicks' views can be challenged in an informed fashion. Explaining postmodernism is a thought-terminating cliché in the guise of a book, and the kinds of arguments laid out in it, rather than inspiring further research, are instead designed to kill curiosity. Because if this is the first book on postmodernism that someone reads, Hicks' goal is that it will also be the last. Thanks for your time.